and myself and my fellow student intern, Joel Wheeler, will be moderating today's panel. We are so excited that you've all joined us today to learn more about one of our office's main policy priorities, hearing from an excellent lineup of distinguished panelists who we are so fortunate to have with us today. First, a few quick housekeeping items. Just so everyone knows, we will have each of our panelists give some opening remarks and a short presentation on their work in relation to the topics of today's panel. Then we're going to be asking them a few prepared questions to get the dialogue sort of started. And then we're going to have a good 20 to 30 minutes at the end for an open audience Q&A. This event is in a webinar format, which means that all attendees have their cameras and microphones disabled. However, there is still a great way to engage with the panel, which is through the Q&A feature. You can send in your questions throughout the event. You can wait until the end if you want to kind of wait for some ideas to sort of generate while we're talking with them, but just at any time, feel free to send in questions, and then we will be selecting questions to ask the panelists at the end of the event during the open Q&A. So again, feel free to send us a question at any time, and we will make sure that those get answered to the best of the time allows. So that should be about everything. And I think we are going to go ahead and get started by introducing our panelists. So first, I would like to introduce Miss Rachel Pickens. She is the Executive Director of the National Police Accountability Project. In this role, she continues to expand programming and membership while identifying new ways that the National Police Accountability Project can lead the discussion of police accountability in America, especially. She joined the organization in 2019, and prior to joining the organization, Rachel worked in the environmental justice sector in New Orleans, focusing mainly on community resilience and water management. She worked in the Lower Ninth Ward and was a founding member of the Water Collaborative of Greater New Orleans. In 2018, she lived in Brisbane, Australia, and she received her JD from Loyola University, New Orleans, and her BA in art history from Boston University.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And we also have with us today Attorney Francis Tom Temprosa, who is the Director of the Human Rights Education and Promotion Office of the Commission of Human Rights in the Republic of the Philippines. He's also a professor of law at the Ateneo de Manila University Law School and a lecturer at the Far Eastern University Institute of Law and the De La Salle University College of Law. He finished his Master of Laws degree from the University of Michigan Law School in the United States on a full-ride scholarship as a Clyde Alton DeWitt Fellow, and he is a PhD in law candidate in the said university. He finished his Juris Doctorate degree with honors from the Ateneo Law School and his Bachelor of Arts in Journalism degree, cum laude, from the University of Philippines, Diliman. Attorney Temprosa, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and coming right up from the Philippines. Good early morning to all of you here.
Yes, we are so grateful that you have elected to join us in the wee hours of the morning there. So thank you. And lastly, to introduce Bruce Knotts, who is our director at the Unitarian Universalist Association Office of the United Nations. He was born and raised in Southern California. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from Pepperdine University and his master's degree in international education from the Monterey Institute of International Studies. Both are in California. Bruce was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia, and he worked for Raytheon in Saudi Arabia and on a World Bank contract in Somalia before he joined the Department of State as a U.S. diplomat in 1984. In 2004, Bruce was elected to the board of Gays and Lesbians in Foreign Affairs agencies. Bruce retired from the Foreign Service in 2007 and joined the Unitarian Universalist Office at the United Nations as its executive director at the beginning of 2008. So, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us. And now that we've introduced all of them, we will hear opening remarks from each of them. We'll get things started with our own director at the Unitarian Universalist Office at the United Nations. Bruce, you have the floor.
Thank you. It's great to be with you today. As you've heard, one of our primary goals at the Unitarian Universalist Association office at the United Nations is the demilitarization of police. And we're very gratified with a recent report that came out of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms of Africans and people of African descent against excessive use of force and other human rights violations by law enforcement. So this is quite interesting that this report is coming out at the same time as that we're pushing on the idea of militarization of police. In addition to racism, which is endemic, I'd say, in a lot of police forces around the world, that there is an increased militarization of the police. If you look at photos, if you Google photos of New York City Police Department, and I'm speaking to you from New York City and on Lenape traditional land, it shows officers in the 1970s in light blue short-sleeve shirts walking around New York City. That's changed a lot in New York City and around the world. You see police in heavily armored vehicles with flak jackets and military-styled helmets, carrying highly lethal weapons. The Democratic nominees, Democratic Party's nominees for mayor of New York is a former member of the New York City Police Force. Eric Adams said that we don't need police forces that have tanks and ride around in tanks.
Bruce, sorry to interrupt you, but I think we're having some audio issues. If we want to get that checked.
Okay.
You're coming in clear now, so I think you're good.
Okay, sorry about that.
Go ahead, no worries.
He said we don't need police forces that run around in tanks and have guns that can shoot planes out of the sky. He said that if it got that bad in New York City, he could call in the National Guard. We also need to acknowledge that the United States, Israel, and other countries are actually exporting militarized police forces and police tactics to other countries. And we're seeing militarized police forces in Brazil, the Philippines, in Myanmar, Hong Kong, and Turkey, and in Belarus, just to name a few. These militarized police forces have military training to kill people in alarming numbers. The police stop a car with a driver that has an air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror, and they kill the driver. The police see a boy playing in a park with a toy gun, and they kill him. In New York City, we saw a man who was selling loose cigarettes, and they kill him. The New York Times calculates that 1,100 people have been killed by the police every year since 2013. Let's shift gears and consider the state-sponsored murder of Jamal Khashoggi by the government of Saudi Arabia. The murder and dismemberment of Washington Post journalist and Saudi citizen Jamal Khashoggi became a global news story with international outrage and condemnation against the government for killing one of their own citizens without any legal basis. The United Nations calls this state-sponsored killings extrajudicial killing. The UN General Assembly has passed several resolutions with near unanimous support against the policy of state-sponsored killings of people without legal process. The police ought to be about preventing and solving crime. They should not be a militarized force with military equipment, military training, using military tactics designed to kill enemy forces against civilian populations. Finally, tying together the earlier comments about the racism on our police forces and the military nature of policing in the United States and around the world, we see how the police use excessive force against Black Lives Matter protesters who peacefully protest. Then we see the absence of that kind of action by the police and National Guard when faced with white supremacist insurrection at the nation's capital. Similarly, peaceful protesters of flawed elections in the Belarus faced violent police action and torture when incarcerated for peaceful protesting in the national election. We see the same against protesters in Hong Kong and Brazil and in other parts of the world. So what can be the alternative? Have the police prevent and solve crimes using the tools they need for that work. Remove all military equipment and gear and training used for war. Ensure that the police are part of the community. I would propose that police receive housing that is part of their compensation and that the housing be in the neighborhoods where they serve. There should be local engagement and accountability. The safety of the community needs to be a shared responsibility of local community leaders and community-based policing. Finally, you and I and all of us children in school everywhere, community leaders and the police need to learn about the history of policing and then change the paradigm of the past where police protected the property of the rich, privileged, and powerful at the expense of the poor and the disenfranchised. We all need to learn critical race theory as it applies to policing. We also need to learn critical gender theory and look at policies through multiple lenses of oppression. We need to change policing to be about preventing and solving crime. Police need to protect and serve the vulnerable and the victimized, and investigate and prosecute financial crimes, crimes of abuse of power, and all those who steal from the poor to enrich themselves. The police should have the funding that is appropriate for the work they do in preventing and solving crimes. Funds not needed for this purpose should be diverted to funding social services, improved housing, improvements to community life such as parks, libraries, daycare centers, community centers, and anything else that builds community, solidarity, and understanding, and the promotion of diversity and inclusion. Doing nothing and perpetuating the status quo cannot be an option. The current system is immoral, illegal, and it contributes to the demolition of democracy and community. To save our democracy and ensure domestic tranquility, we need community policing that is nonviolent and that protects and serves the vulnerable and victimized. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Knotts. And next up, we will hear from Mrs. Pickens, Director of the National Police Accountability Project.
Thank you again for having me. So let me start with sharing my screen. I have just a few slides, nothing too special. All right, and all right, can you all see this? Okay, sweet. So first off, I just want to talk more about the organization I'm representing. So the National Police Accountability Project, you can call it NPAP or NPAP, whichever you prefer. We've been around since 1999, and we are a project of the National Lawyers Guild. The National Lawyers Guild, NLG, they are the first integrated bar association in the United States. The NPAP, we currently have over 600 members in the country. And our mission, our overarching mission is to support and provide resources to our membership. They are civil rights attorneys who represent victims of police and prison misconduct. unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to criminally prosecute law enforcement. So one of the avenues to have any type of recourse against this type of violence is through civil litigation. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the settlements that families and their victims have received in the various years, and that's usually because of the work that the attorneys in our membership do. Doesn't make the family whole. They still lost loved ones, but there is one monetary recourse for this horrendous events. So since last year, since the murder of George Floyd, there were obviously protests in this country and around the world. And Impact, we have expanded our mission, and we are now working on legislation in state, federal, and municipal level on creating proactive change so that these type of events don't happen in the future. So let's bring it down to what's been going, in DC and other places in the country. So as I said before, there's been a lot of response to what happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and then numerous others that we've heard in the news, and the more that we haven't heard. And one of these avenues has been through legislation on the federal level. Currently, there is one bill called the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. It's it's been introduced, it's been passed through the House, and right now it's in negotiations in the Senate. And one of these sections is called the Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act. It was introduced by Hank Johnson. He is a Democratic representative from Georgia. And the spirit of this section is to place really strict restrictions on the 1033 program. That's a program that allows the Department of Defense to transfer all its excess military equipment to law enforcement agencies, state, local, and federal as well. Through this program, there's been over $7 billion worth of equipment that have ended on the streets. So this section some of the details of this section includes preventing any transfers of weapons that are inappropriate for local policing, requiring that they account for all military weapons and equipment, and enforce tracking mechanisms. There's been a huge issue of making sure that these weapons, if they need to be in existence at all, that they are tracked properly and that they are used in the way that should be, but quite frankly, they shouldn't be on the streets, period. Another bill that kind of addresses the same issue is called the Demilitarizing Local Law Enforcement Act of 2021. Another Democratic sponsor, Representative Nadia Velasquez from New York. It was introduced last year in 2020, and she brought it back for this year. And this one is just ending the program entirely, so that there is no transfer of military property from federal agencies to state and local agencies. So these are the main two US policies and legislation that is being worked on right now. I haven't heard of any state or local bills that address the same issue, and quite frankly, this is one of the reasons why there is militarization in the United States. So how does this show up? Well, obviously there's the weapons and equipment. As Bruce mentioned, the protests that we all saw this past year, protesters were met with military grade weapons, grenades, chemical smoke, that kind of thing. Raids, Breonna Taylor. What happened was a local SWAT team, came into her home, no knock warrant, and these military style raids were used in her home, and as a result, she was killed. And like I said before, protests. And it wasn't just last summer that these type of weapons and tanks happened. It was Standing Rock, it was Ferguson. It's been years and years of seeing local police departments and local law enforcement use these weapons of war. And some of them have been banned by international treaties against, American citizens who are using their First Amendment rights to protest. Another way that militarization has been manifested in policing has been also financial incentive. So there's this concept called civil asset forfeiture. which basically law enforcement can seize and sell your property if they think it was part of a crime. So the way it usually works out is if they pull you over in your car and they think that they find entirely in versus protesters and versus your own communities. And a lot of cops they see themselves as just soldiers and like in the occupying spaces. And also there's just like a pipeline, former, armed force service people who go to local law enforcement. So militarization is not just weapons and equipment that we've seen used against people using their First Amendment rights, but it's also a mindset and just how they manage and run the police departments. And I just wanted to do that as a quick grounding for our conversation, because there is discussion about how to stop it, but there's also, I think it's important to lay out like how militarization shows in day-to-day and how it affects us. But that's it. So thank you so much. I will stop share.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pickens, for that overview. And next we will hear from Attorney Francis Tom Temprosa, Director of the Human Rights Education and Promotion Office of the Commission on Human Rights in the Republic of the Philippines. Attorney Temprosa, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Joel, and it's really great to be here. So what I'm gonna do now is talk about three things. First, I'm gonna talk about the Commission on Human Rights, which I'm part of currently, and then I will discuss a bit about the law, since we are talking about an issue that deeply touches upon the law. And I just want to share a few things about accountability efforts. What I want to highlight in my portion is the role of the law, and at the same time, the perspective of a country from the global South, which also has or faces some issues concerning demilitarization and the issue of extrajudicial violence, extrajudicial killings. So first up, the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines is a national human rights institution. I'm part of the commission as Director for Human Rights Education and Promotion. Basically, a human rights institution at the national level is a state institution, so it's a check and balance institution. The mandate is to promote human rights, to educate the public about human rights, to prevent human rights violations from happening, to also, of course, to protect human rights. So those, broadly speaking, I would say are how we sort of interpret our own mandate. When it comes to the protection of human rights, the Philippine Human Rights Commission investigates human rights violations involving civil and political rights. The investigation that we do is not really a what do you call a judicial investigation. What we investigate are violations of human rights, and then we recommend prosecution for the prosecutors to then go ahead and file cases for human rights violations if warranted. So I would say that the education part, which I'm very much leading, is about developing a culture of human rights. That's what we want to call it. Of course, this is based on the value of human dignity, on truth, on, of course, human rights, accountability, and many other things. So I just want to talk about the law. international law, since I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to talk about it a bit. We do have this treaty on civil and political rights. Of course, there are guarantees there on the right to life, the right to due process, fair trial rights, among others. I would like to say that an observation that comes out very, very succinctly is that, clearly, many times is that, concept of extrajudicial killings is not really a well-defined term. People see it as a violation of one's right to due process. People can also see it as a violation of processes that have to be undergone, and also fair trial rights. But others would like to see it as simply the case of murder. Murder by authorities, abuse of power, abuse of authority. In the Philippines, so this brings me now to sort of the local landscape. In the Philippines, extrajudicial killings defined by our own Supreme Court is committed without due process of law. So that's the very important thing to look into. So that means that there is no legal safeguard, or there is no judicial proceeding when the life is taken. Of course, the picture is much more complicated uh, because there has been a mechanism that was put up to investigate extrajudicial killings, but the victim is limited in the sense that the victim has to be a murderer or affiliated with an organization for political, environmental, agrarian, labor, or similar causes. So a media practitioner, a person apparently mistaken or identified to be any of those, etc. So what I'm saying is that there is really that problem of the definition, and also the problem with the numbers. The problem of the numbers. Um, how many people have died? What are the cases? Are they really extrajudicial killings, and whatnot? So, and the third bit that I want to quickly touch upon is the situation about extrajudicial killings and accountability efforts. Having said that, international law does not really define what extrajudicial killings are. We then now, I think that globally, most countries really lean on to the domestic. And there's the demand for domestic law to be thick, in the sense that it sort of provides uh, recourse whenever there's a violation. But other countries don't do that. Don't have that in their laws. Other countries, as Rachel put out there, have a very militarized approach to this. And then I would just like to add that international law does not also provide clear guidance, because it's not really well defined. And so the question of accountability efforts now arise. In the Philippines, as you all know, probably know, there's been this ongoing war on drugs, which has reportedly claimed lives of people in the context of police operations. So this is really a global problem. It's not really one that is just confined to the global north or in the United States. And I would just like to stress one point in this regard. I would say that accountability efforts should be pursued whether at the global or at the international level. I think that, and I propose that, people's right to know the truth should always be there. It should be based on basic human rights principles, and it really is more than anything else about justice. It's a question of justice and abuse of authority. So I'll stop there. I think I've gone over for a minute, but looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Temprosa, and not a problem at all. Looks like we're right on schedule. So yeah, next we will move into our questions section. We have a few prepared questions. But we also invite the attendees to submit any questions that you might have, either for the entire panel or for a specific panelist using the Q&A function. And then we will get to those in about 20 to 30 minutes. So I will start with you, Attorney Temprosa. In lieu of what you just mentioned on extrajudicial killings, do you think that it is appropriate for the International Criminal Court to seek indictments for heads of state who are responsible for extrajudicial killings?
I think that the answer there is not very clear, because as I said, extrajudicial killings is more of a term of art right now in international law. We really don't know what is extrajudicial killing. Some people say it's just murder, or depending on how local law or the law, for example, in the United States will define it, then that's the one that should be followed at the domestic level at least. I said earlier that I think all avenues for accountability should be pursued naturally, but they also have their limits. The ICC, for example, the International Criminal Court, will have to look into whether any of the acts of killings or the acts of killings collectively, either one of them or all of them are, they fall as genocide, crimes against humanity, aggression. What I'm saying is basically the four covered crimes of the court. And if there is really no showing that they fall under that, then we have a problem. Also, the ICC has this at least the statute of the court has this provision about complementarity, meaning that the court only steps in when the state is unable or unwilling to prosecute, to investigate and prosecute. So that has to be a factor that should be considered. So your question is, as I would say, is a bit more complicated. But at the end of the day, I think what's more important is that we see justice. We see justice, whether at the domestic or at the international level. And, we're playing the long game of accountability here, which is really sometimes you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it is always there and it should always be there.
Thank you very much for your response to that. I am going to be asking the next question to Ms. Pickens, which is what are the most critical ways, in your view, in which U.S. law upholds and enables these unjust law enforcement systems and practices, and what are the most critical ways in which U.S. law can be used to restrain or fight back against these systems or practices?
So when I first read the question, I was like, there's so much that the US law does that allows these atrocities to happen. I mean, I'll jump off what Tom has been saying, and it's in the title of my organization, is accountability. There's a life cycle of interaction with police, and we'll start with the after effects, which is the accountability. So, between 2005 and 2020, there were 42 officers that were convicted of shooting on duty, but only 5 were convicted of murder. And as Bruce mentioned, every year around over 1,000 people in the United States are killed by officers, but we don't even have the numbers on how many injuries there have been. Cities have paid out billions of dollars for these settlements, but the officers are usually on the job. They don't get fired. They don't get reprimanded. It's actually taxpayers who are paying these, taxpayers in the country of the United States. We're the ones paying these settlements. So it's really hard to have any culture of accountability if the actors who cause this harm have no skin in the game. And it's built like that. It's really hard to criminally charge and prosecute officers. You have to show intent, and it's really hard to show mens rea and intent. So usually prosecutors never meet that standard. And oftentimes too, let's not forget, prosecutors and law enforcement, they have a very close relationship. You know, they need officers when they have other cases. So there is, you know, apologies here, my dogs. There's this really close relationship that they don't want to risk. And yeah, so, and another thing too, so there's this concept called qualified immunity. It's a term that's been thrown around a lot these past few months, and for good reason. It's run the huge barriers for civil litigators when it comes to bringing these cases. So what is qualified immunity? It's this Supreme Court created doctrine that basically shows that for your case to be heard by a jury, you have to show one of two things: that it was unconstitutional, and that there is precedence of this case. So the way that, how it works now, and what really trips people up, is you get to show a case that's exactly like the one that you had. So let's say I'm talking right now and a cop comes, you know, barges in my door and shoots me. You have to find the exact same facts in a case that has been heard by like this district court or Supreme Court. So let's say the attorneys that are on my case representing my family, you know, they find a case in which the cops came through the back door instead of the front. That's enough of a difference for my case to be thrown out, or for it to go on appeal, and then my case is just extended for years and years and years. So it takes more time, it takes more money, and there's a reason why these settlements take, you know, 3 to 5 years, because of all these barriers and like that really hinder, you know, accountability. And then, you know, if you want to start, you know, before an interaction, like let's say it's very hard to see the lack of transparency. That's what I'm trying to get. The lack of transparency when it comes to like seeing the internal policies. How does it actually work inside a police, like in the police station? So, I'm always aghast at how many other ways it's very hard to keep cops accountable, and all the structures that hold into place. I mean, some other, and I know you said the priorities, but there's just so many. And I mean, another thing is the budgets. And I know that's not like a US law thing, but there's this thing called the Bill of Rights for police officers, that they have extra special protections that a normal citizen doesn't have. And a lot of it is incorporated into the budget. You know, Los Angeles Police Department, they get billions of dollars a year. And if you look at the Bill of Rights and the union contract, it's very hard to take away money from an officer, from that budget, to other things. So when we're talking about what does it look like for public safety, like outside of a police scene, and what does it look like, and how much money do other areas of public safety need? It's kind of impossible to have a conversation, because in reality, you can't move the unions and the way the law is written. It's very hard to transfer one pot of money to other avenues. So those are just a few ways in which the U.S. the legal system upholds these patterns of police violence in this country, and how to combat that. There isn't really law yet. That it's starting to happen state by state. So New Mexico, they got rid of qualified immunity. So it has Colorado, Montana. I think 5 states in this country have got rid of qualified immunity. The ideal situation is just banned in both state and federal court. But depending on what happens with this George Floyd Justice Policing Act, that may not happen. We'll see. We'll see what comes out in the Senate. You know, the Republicans, they are really doing what they do and trying to just nix out anything that could be actually beneficial towards us, and anything that's truly holding people accountable. Bias training is fine, but that's bare minimum. Having cameras on people, that's a bare minimum. Like that shouldn't even be part of the discussion of what it means to have better policing. Those are just the basics. So we will see. I mean, I'm still optimistic that there will be federal change in regards to how policing looks when it comes to accountability, when it comes to funding, when it comes to transparency. But there's a reason why my organization and so many others are looking at the state and municipal level, because we can't depend on the federal legislation, and we have to be proactive. We just can't wait to see what's going to happen in the next few months. So yeah, those are the few things that I've observed in regards to how the law upholds it and how we can get rid of it. But we can talk more during Q&A and such like that.
Thank you so much for that response. I found that really informative. And you mentioned so many important pieces to this discussion. I'll turn now to Bruce. Bruce, you have experience working internationally in the Foreign Service and in other organizations, as mentioned previously. And perhaps you learned about how member states of the UN or civil society groups like the UUA, they've successfully advocated for changes similar to this one that's a priority for our office to demilitarize police forces. What can you tell us from what you've learned about successes you've witnessed in other parts of the world, or regarding policies relevant to the context in the United States?
Well, I'm going to do my best here. I hope my mic is better than it was before. Sorry about that former incident. What we're talking about here is holding people accountable. And we're not doing a very good job. Domestic law is not doing a very good job. International law is not doing a very good job. And we don't do a very good job. And I would say part of what we need to do as people, as voters, as citizens, is to be far more outraged, and to be more outraged more often. What happened with George Floyd was amazing. And there was international outrage. The Human Rights Council in Geneva met for 3 days. Every member of the Human Rights Council talked about the killing of George Floyd. So there was international, ubiquitous outrage over this terrible murder of George Floyd by a police officer. And yet we just heard we have over 1,000 people killed by the police every year. And in most cases, the outrage is tepid. And we just had a presidential election, and I'm not sure the demilitarization of police came up that much. You know, we talked about the economy, we talked about other things. And one of the things I was taught in my graduate work was the power of questions. And we should be questioning our legislators. And that means city council people, that means state legislators, that means, you know, Congress and Senate and president and everybody that's running for office, because all these levels of government, and even up into the international level, but we should be asking questions, and we should be doing it all the time. This is what I have seen be, you know, it's moving an issue from a bottom tier issue up to a top tier issue. And the way you do that is by constant questioning, and you question everybody about everything about this issue all the time. And every time somebody is killed, we should have the kind of outrage we had when George Floyd was killed. It should be something that we just don't tolerate. And we've got to let our elected officials know, and international, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We're not going to tolerate it in the United States, or in the Philippines, or in India, or in Belarus, or in Turkey, or in Hungary, or anywhere that it happens. We're just not going to tolerate it. So it's on us, and we need to get more active and show our outrage and ask more questions and get involved in the politics of this. Because unfortunately, and we have to change the laws. and then we have to enforce the laws. And we're not quite there yet.
Thank you very much. Couldn't agree more, Bruce. I'll turn back to Attorney Temprosa. Yeah, to kind of follow up on what your answer from earlier. You know, could you maybe say more about, you know, particular nation states that, or examples of the kind of nation states that might be more difficult, thinking that there would be international precedent for something or specific, you know, provisions in international law, or somehow we're able to more specifically define extrajudicial killings. I mean, I think perhaps to use the United States as an example where international law is not automatically domesticated, perhaps you could explain for our participants that caveat that could make it more challenging in certain nations that that are constitutionally constructed in that way, that international law is not automatically superseding domestic law, and what the challenges associated with that could be.
Sure, yeah. We also have the same situation in my country. Largely the Philippines, I don't know if many of you know, but we were a colony of the United States for a good number of years. And we were a commonwealth. So I don't know if it's really a good thing or a bad thing. Because if international law is very deficient, if there's really a problem in international law, and I want to circle back to what Bruce and Rachel also said earlier, we have the tendency as human beings to go back to the law, of course. We want to enforce the rule of law. But the problem now is, what if the law is very deficient? What if the law does not really respond to what we want in the pursuit of justice or equality or accountability, etc.? So I don't know if it's really a good thing or a bad thing. It's good if international law is responsive to meeting the demands of justice. It's bad if international law supersedes a good domestic law. And international law is bad in that respect. So I'm kind of on the fence right there, but I think that for me, I'm a believer in localizing things, because at the end of the day, honestly, you talked about trying to see the issue from different lenses, and one of the lenses that is very powerful is seeing the issue as an issue of power. I would say, when you give somebody a gun, when you give somebody the whole entire force of the police behind that person becomes larger than life. And checks and balances have to be there, obviously. We need to definitely change the law. We need to implement better laws. And talking about the limits of international law as well, is as I said earlier, in international law, at least on the ICC, on the prosecution side of things, you need to make sure that you have to know rather if the extrajudicial killing constitutes one of the crimes that are punishable under international criminal law. If not, then you have a problem. So the challenge there is making domestic law really relevant and responsive, because you also have the challenge of the timing in international. It has to be within the within the time that the court is able to exercise jurisdiction. And of course, it has to be inside the territory of the particular state. So that's really a challenge for us, even because we pulled out of the ICC. The Philippines pulled out of the ICC a few years ago, while the war on drugs was raging. And so I'm not really sure. I guess whatever works should work. I guess that's my answer for you there, Joel. Whatever is best. I mean, we have, as I said, we want to go to international law. What if international law is not responsive to it? Yeah.
All right, thank you again, Mr. Temprosa, for that. And now moving on to the next question, but really quickly, I just want to say we have a few more questions prepared, and then we are planning on heading into the open Q&A. So again, if anyone has questions for the panelists, we would highly encourage you to send those in, either now or as we get closer to that. So moving on to Ms. Pickens again, I wanted to ask you what you see as the role of community in standing up to police injustice, both in areas more and less directly affected by the issues. So I know that I'm coming from a community that recently we have had a sort of renewed dialogue about the failures of law enforcement and the sort of racism and injustice in our own community. But by and large, this seems to be an issue that, you know, some people and some communities seem more distant or more close to it. And I wanted to ask what you sort of see as the roles of these communities, regardless of how proximate we are, and sort of what we can do regardless of that, or with that in mind.
Thank you for that question. So the first answer would be what you're kind of doing now, Andrew, in regards to starting conversations about policing, what it means to have a police force that is central to public safety. It's hard to start thinking about change when you don't really know where you're coming from and where you currently are. I mean, for the United States, you know, police forces started from slave patrols, and now, you know, they're truly just forces to protect property and wealthy individuals. So, you know, when I see a police car, I don't feel safe, you know, and it's usually in neighborhoods that are over policed. So that's the first thing, is like community and conversation. Another aspect of it is first and last and always is protesting. The reason all this stuff happened to begin with is because of protests in the country and around the world. Politicians, you know, they try to do their thing, and I know some of them still are, but let's be real, the only reason we've had any of these changes on the state, federal level is because of protests. And just organizers and communities have been doing this work for decades and years. And it was a timing of George Floyd and COVID, and I think years and years of, you know, footage of seeing, you know, Black and brown bodies, you know, murdered over and over again. Another thing communities can do is vote. I know we all showed up in the United States in the last election with Biden, and that's great, but we have to be persistent. I know the Republican Party, they bank on people not coming out during midterm elections and, you know, special elections and local elections. And, you know, we have to, and the thing about voting is important, but also who you're voting for, being very intentional about asking the candidates, what's your position on, you know, funding and policing? What's your opinion on policing to begin with? I mean, both parties have received a lot of money from police unions and, you know, police fraternities. So that's a complicating factor. It's not just one party in this country, you know, that they're probably more police than the other, but they still are both getting paid a lot of money. So really supporting candidates who are about true change, reform, abolition, any of the words that speak to you, that's something we all have to do, that homework. And I think that's a responsibility of being a person in this country, and any country, is like being active in like civic engagement. We've seen forever that most times when you want politicians to do something, they don't do it out of their own goodwill. You have to force them to do it. So that's the attitude that I think I've definitely seen more civic engagement in like these upcoming generations, like younger people. I think have seen how important it is. And then another thing I want to talk about is community and imagination. If we are to ask what can be better for us, we have to start those conversations and, you know, imagination building with each other. Like why do we have police officers come to my house when my stuff gets stolen? They don't usually find someone. They don't find the robber usually. Like, it's there for insurance purposes. Why is that? Why do we have police officers doing traffic stops? You know, and I mean, we've seen how many people have been killed just by being pulled over. And we have to break away from this belief that anytime something happens to you, whether it's you or your property or someone you love, like, the police have to be involved. So reimagining and reconsidering, like, what are other ways to deal with issues that will come to be, like mental health crises. Again, like, why do police need to be involved? But I mean, trained for it. So that, I think that's really important. Not just like voting, protesting, all that's important, but consistently talking and thinking and being in community with others about what's better, what could work, and what doesn't work, and why. And then tapping into the multiple ways to like manifest that and supporting each other, because this is like going to be many lifetimes of work, because it's you know, this system has been, at least in the United States, has been built for centuries. So it's going to take even more to like really dismantle that.
Thank you very much. I see we have a question in the chat. Again, thank you for sending that in, and feel free to continue sending in any questions either through the chat or the Q&A function. And now I want to ask another question to Mr. Knotts. So Bruce, what opportunity, or what unique opportunities, and by extension responsibilities, do you see large-scale religious structures, organizations, institutions, etc., such as the Unitarian Universalist Association, as having in the global pursuit against injustice, and perhaps specifically police injustice, or, you know, related to the topic, but just in general, these large-scale religious structures are huge ways of mobilizing communities, and how do you see our sort of unique roles and opportunities in that struggle? Thank you.
We do work, and we not only work with ourselves, but we work with Religions for Peace and the Parliament of the World's Religions and other interfaith groups. And I think there's a growing awareness that as people of faith, we have an obligation to work for justice. That's part of our faith tradition. We have an obligation to you know, make sure that the poor are taken care of, and these are obligations that we have. And I'm hoping that there is more coalescing around issues of you know, bad policing. I mean, when Rachel Pickens was talking, it reminded me, particularly with insurance companies, we had $20,000 disappear from our bank account, and we called the bank and we wanted to sort things out, and they said, well, you have to get a police report. And so I go with my African-American husband to get a police report, and they immediately point at him and say, maybe he stole it. I said, it's our joint bank account. He didn't steal anything. It's the money belongs to both of us. But that's the default position of the police. And it doesn't even matter in many cases whether the police are black or white or brown or whatever. They get the same kind of training and they come to the same faulty conclusions. And I think we need to, all of us as human beings, first of all, need to say that we have an obligation for justice, and the police are not doing justice, and we need to change that. But particularly people of faith, I think there's a further obligation for us to get involved. The primary goals of the Unitarian Universalist Association is dismantling white supremacy, demilitarizing the police, and climate justice. Those are our three top priorities. And I would like to see all faith traditions have those three top priorities, because those are critical, and they're critical not only domestically here in the United States, but around the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. I think I really appreciated something you mentioned, that sometimes, you know, the diversification of police forces does not guarantee a shift in practices. I'm wondering if maybe you, Bruce, or Ms. Pickens or Mr. Temprosa, anybody can really comment on this, because I know that this was specifically done in the context of South Africa when they created a new and fairly progressive constitution, and they had a shift and a complete overhaul of their police units, shifting from a majority white force to a majority black force. But yet some of the same police abuses persist, including killings by police officers. So I'm wondering if anyone has comments on that, or any thoughts on the benefit or the limitations of diversifying police forces as one of many solutions to this issue.
I can, if you don't mind, I can go ahead. So diversity is great in all contexts, but it doesn't mean anything if like the culture itself is really, really terrible. I was going to curse, but I stopped myself. Yeah, I mean, training. I mean, they're not trained for long compared to other professions, you know? I mean, I remember there's a sign during a protest that I think hairdressers have more training than officers, but I think a core part of that training is just that groupthink of, this is what you do, this is who you are, and this is how things are done. And you know, I will say there are, I'm sure, a lot of officers who, and a lot more too these past few months, have spoken out about like how it works and how, you know, there's all these abuses and, you know, acts of violence against, you know, communities, but then they're cast out, they're iced out, they're fired, they're transferred. So I'm not a big fan of the whole bad apples thing, quite frankly, because no one ever finishes the saying of, you know, spoils the whole bunch. And it doesn't signify that this is a systemic cultural issue. So that's kind of like the first and last point of like the question you answered is diversity is great. And it really does work when you have genuine space and room for voices and dissent and constructive criticism. But that's not what we have in the police forces that I see every day. So until there's like this massive overhaul of just what policing is, you know, it doesn't really matter how many people and who comes into the services, because, you know, at the end of the day, you know, there's this mindset that I need to go home and, you know, I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. And, you know, lack of consequences is also pervasive and kind of dictates how they treat, you know, people on a day-to-day basis.
Great, thank you for that response, especially for you know, an off-the-cuff question. I think it's very insightful, and we're now seeing a bit more of audience participation and questions coming in, so we're gonna move towards those. But first, really quick, I just wanted to ask a general question to the whole panel, and this is something that we actually also had a question about for Q&A, basically, which is, what can participants do to take action? So I know a couple of you have spoken about various ways that we can get involved in our communities and in, you know, advocating for these systems, but I think that it's kind of a tendency for people, and, you know, I've been guilty of this at times, to hear, oh, well, you know, these are great ways for, you know, people to get involved who want to be activists and organizers and who want to lead this charge, but I'm just a person. I'm just here at this panel and I'm hearing these ideas, and I'm not really sure what I can do. So what is something that sort of just the average attendee or just average person in this country or in any country can do to get involved, if any of you have thoughts on that?
Andrew, can I jump in a bit? Yeah, I totally agree with what Rachel said earlier. I just want to add a thing or two. I think the first thing I want to say is, as ordinary citizens, as people without really the arsenal of the state backing us up, you've got so much power inside your pocket. Look at your phone. And this comes from sort of a global perspective and also a very US perspective. We know that George Floyd, the power of video, the power of the image, is just right there. Um, People get it's an advocacy tool for people. So I just also want to share that there is one conviction of on the war on drugs in the Philippines, and it involved a video of a child essentially being carried by a police officer at gunshot point, and then the child was killed. Uh, so I think without that video, personally, this is just my personal analysis, the public would have not been really sort of informed very well, or their emotions were not really very much touched by the experience, because sometimes, as Andrew was saying, these things tend to happen in the abstract. We are secluded from the outside of the world, but the image is very much present inside our homes whenever we watch them. So I think, as ordinary citizens, reach to your cell phones, document incidents of abuses. Don't be afraid. Just tap onto your phone. The other point I want to share is, and this one is coming from a very personal, personal perspective, is that I being a graduate student in the United States, I see the difference between communities there and communities elsewhere. I think that in Western societies, we're used to have bigger bubbles, bigger personal spaces, and so the notion of community gets lost, and the notion of the self is larger. I think that policing really starts from sort of a sense of community. Good policing is about looking to your neighbor. Is there anything wrong with my neighbor? Although he's like a few yards away or a few meters away from me, I can't see him or her or them. But it starts from that awareness that somebody else is around you. Uh, and it gets lost as the world becomes more urban, as we're faced with many of the constraints of everyday life. There's the Filipino term for that. Uh, it's essentially about knowing that there are people around you and you should care for them. So look to your neighbor, see if there's anything wrong, and if there's a crime that's happening, you might want to be there. See if the police is acting responsibly to that. It's not being nosy, it's just acting out of concern for people. So I just want to add that.
Thank you. I think in line with what others have been saying, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but I think part of the solution might come with breaking up police departments. I think they're too large, and certainly police unions are too large. And there really is this it's almost like the mafia. You know, you're dead if you say anything against a fellow police officer. You'll be, you know, you're out of the service. And it's why even when you have a diverse police force, which is better than a non-diverse police force, but having diversity doesn't bring the results that we hope. But if you broke police departments up, and so say here in New York, if there was one police force for the Bronx and another police force for Brooklyn, another police force for different communities, and it should be organized in such a way that people actually know the police in their community, that they attend church, they go shopping, they're in that community, and people know each other, they know each other by name. And I think if you can get that community sense, and the police are part of that community. I said in my opening remarks, if depending on what you heard from my mic, but I said, you know, a lot of places I've been in South Asia and other parts of the world, your housing is part of your compensation package. And so giving the police a house, you know, housing, an apartment in the area where they will be policing, which means that their children will go to the same schools as your children go to. They're part of the community. I'm not going to say that's going to solve all the problems, but it might be a step in the right direction.
Great. Thank you all so much for your answers on that one. I think we will move now to some of the Q&A from our attendees. And I will start actually with a question for you, Bruce, and we can also get thoughts from Ms. Pickens and Mr. Temprosa on this one. This one's so specific about the UU congregation, so I wanted to direct it to you, Bruce. We have on the call a member from a UU church that's in partner with a Filipino church, and they say that they heard the Filipino human rights lawyers report as saying that because essentially extrajudicial killing isn't clearly defined, that Duterte's strongman tactics are re-alleged drug dealers is something he can essentially get away with, along with the military forces that he directs. So how do more disadvantaged Filipino or in other places internationally, how do UUs that are in that situation, how do they deal with such a situation as this? And what can those of us in the West or in the global North do to support them?
I don't know. You want me to take that? I mean, I know our congregation in the Philippines. They're mostly on Negros Island, and they're a minority religion. We're not a major religion within the Philippines, nor in the United States or pretty much anywhere else. And I think we are most powerful when we make common cause with other faith traditions. And you know, of course, the big one in the Philippines and also here in the United States, if you could get buy-in from the Catholics to support demilitarization of police and getting police to act in a manner according to scriptures or according to our belief systems, that would be great. Operating on their own, that's tough, but I do like Tom's solution because it has changed the world. The idea of having a camera on your cell phone and being a documentary person and taking videos of what's going on around you has changed the world. All the things that we've seen with Black Lives Matter and everything else, it has all started with videos. And so, you know, being reporters in your community and taking videos of what you see and reporting that and putting it on social media or whatever has a huge impact, more than perhaps anything else we've talked about so far. And I thank Tom for raising that because it's very important.
All right, great. Thank you for that, Bruce. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next sort of audience Q&A question, and this one seems to be just for the whole panel. I'll just read off the question and then sort of maybe reframe it a little bit, but the question was, the legal framework, both at national and international levels, may not be perfect, but why is it not fulfilled? Why is it not perfect? Laws can be improved, but no one is better by decree. The point is how to make the law and good wishes materialize. What do we do to make our societies less violent? There is police violence and social violence. What do we do then so that our society is not violent? So I think sort of the point that this question is getting at is that there is sort of these social institutions or legal institutions such as law enforcement, but they are operating within this larger social framework of violence. We've seen a lot of countries, including the US, sort of favor these very like tough on crime approaches or these violent approaches to dealing with crime or other social problems. So if anyone has thoughts on how we can sort of advocate for a social move away from violence or towards these other sort of frameworks for justice, then I think that's sort of what this question is getting at, if anyone has thoughts on that.
Andrew, I think that's a very hard question. I think for me that sounded more like a cry for help. It really is. I think how do we become non-violent? Obviously, I don't have the answer. I don't think if what I'm saying is gonna make sense, but I think structural reforms are really needed more than anything. Cultural reforms are needed. Um, it really is about reframing, and this is one thing that this is very important for me. Reframing our sense of justice also. Justice is not about violence. I think because police officers and I mean, not all police officers, of course, there are good ones, but there is that thinking that for justice to happen, there has to be violence. I need to shoot somebody because he killed somebody, or I need to, I'm gonna arrest you because you're driving in the wrong way, and then I'm gonna like put handcuffs on you and then shoot you after. No, there is a better way of doing things, obviously. And I think we're still stuck in the bigger debate. There is our sense of punishment is really about retribution. I think all over the world, I think that's still the predominant way of approaching criminality. It's really about punishment. It's not about rehabilitation. It's not about second chances. And this leads me to the greater debate also of the death penalty. I don't know what your thoughts there are, but for me, death penalty shouldn't and cannot and must not be imposed. We should give people second chances. Um, so I think that thinking has to really also be changed. So for the police officers, you might want to try a different approach rather than doing some violence. And I think give people second chances.
Yeah, you're in my head, Tom. I was thinking restorative justice because I mean that I think the question, there's like two categories of violence, which is police violence and then violence that happens within communities. So I think you answered the question pretty well, Tom, about police violence and how they and just like how the law is used in regards to prosecution and charging and then sentencing and the interactions with police, and it's all, I think the core of it's deterrence. They think deterrence works is like we show people like what could happen to you, others won't do that, and that's not true. There's whole discussions about why people do things, but I think a big part of it is like the lack of resources and like just a growing divide of equity, equality, and resources that every day billions of people are experiencing, and they use crime as like last resort. And there's there's all these gaps, you know, all this underfunding, education, everything except policing is like underfunded. And it's going to get worse with climate change. We haven't discussed that, and I know we don't have time, but I can already imagine with climate change and, you know, cities and regions either being burned or flooded or swept away, like there'll be more migration and movements, and these will be people who have lower education, lower income, and they're already disenfranchised, and they're going to be continually be over policed. So that's another angle that I think we will have to take into account. Like, what is violence and where's it come from? That's a whole philosophical question that people smarter than me have been discussing for a long time. And people in the future now are talking about like how to address these various forms and why they happen and what could be used to like resolve them in ways that don't cause more harm, and not just the individual and the victims, but in the communities themselves.
Yeah, I'm about ready to release an item that I just wrote, and I said, you know, in order to demilitarize the police, we need to demilitarize our citizens. We have more personal guns in this country than we have people. And we do have this attitude that the solution to problems is a gun. It is prevalent in our movies. It's prevalent in our literature. You know, we do have a very violent kind of culture that we deal with. You know, we have a problem in Korea. Send in the troops, and we had the Korean War, and we divided a country in half. We have a problem in Vietnam. Send in the troops, and you know, thousands die, and billions of dollars, trillions of dollars get spent, and we lose the war. And now we're leaving Afghanistan after 20 years in that country, and we had overwhelming force. You know, there was no lack of power on our side, but the power didn't result in anything good. Israel tries to do the same thing to the Palestinians, you know, overwhelm them with military force, and that's going to make the Palestinians not want their land or not want their rights. It doesn't work, and we've got to get out of this mindset that the solution to a problem is overwhelming force, because we try it over and over and over again, domestically, internationally, and it doesn't work. And we need to find better ways of solving problems than overwhelming force and violence.
Thank you, everyone, for your sort of input on that question. I think that was kind of a great way to kind of wrap up the panel, as we're now running a bit close to 4:30, and we do want to make sure that we're respecting everyone's time. So really quick, before we do our sort of final wrap-up comments, I just want to plug this link that we just put in the chat. Obviously, you know, if you don't have time, we want to make sure to be respectful of everyone's time. But if you are willing and able, we would love it if people would be able to complete this survey just to give us feedback on the event and how we can sort of plan these events better in the future, or anything that you sort of liked as well, just to make sure that we're giving proper gratitude and credit to our amazing panelists today. So let's make sure that the survey has the proper sharing permissions. So we will make sure that that gets addressed really quick, and then this will also be sent out in the email follow-up to the event. And speaking of, I think that takes us to our little wrap-up here. So we are basically out of time now, but want to just give one final thank you to our panelists for a robust and informative discussion today, and to all of you, to our attendees who stayed engaged through excellent questions and you know, stayed committed throughout the Q&A as well. We just posted the link in the chat. We'll be making sure that the survey permissions are set correctly when we get it sent out in the email addresses. we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone who attended to make sure that you all have the sort of recording, the survey here, which should now, by the way, have correct sharing permissions if anyone wants to send out their feedback now or fill that out now. But we will be again sending out the recording, sending out some sort of follow-up materials and everything to everyone who registered ahead of time. And yeah, I believe that about wraps it up. So thank you all again so much for attending, and to our incredible panelists for providing their voices and their experiences. And yeah, we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I don't know if anyone else has anything really quick to close with, but yeah, just thank you all so much.
Let me thank Andrew and Joel for all the hard work they did to put this together, and for Rob Kipp and for Allison Hess, who are behind the scenes and working very hard, also helped us put this on. And for our amazing panelists, I learned a lot from both of you, Rachel and Tom. You really did a great job. I hope we get a chance to work together again soon. And I think Tom deserves a special thank you for being up at 3 a.m. in the morning to be with us from the Philippines. So thank you so much for your wisdom and for your courage. And we want to work with you and help you in your work. Thank you.
Yeah, a pleasure. Thanks for having us. Thanks.
Same. Thank you so much.